Who among us hasn't had a sleepover? Definitely not me. No matter when your first sleepover was, or who it was with, it's no secret that there can be both good and bad experiences. Sometimes we're with our dearest friends, other times we're with acquaintances, and sometimes we can end up with people we really don't know. Here are 3 stories about experiences that fell in the creepy and downright terrifying section of the spectrum. But real quick, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who's been tuning in to see these videos. I know they're not the best quality, but it really means a lot. If you like what you see and hear, consider liking the video, leaving a comment, and subscribing. I do put a lot of random stuff up on my channel, so if you do subscribe, consider leaving the notifications on personalized or disabling them altogether. Now without further ado, let's get to the stories. Story 1. Back in 5th grade, I had a sleepover with a kid named Brandon, who I wasn't really friends with. We'd been in the same class in 2nd grade, and though I never got to know him, he always seemed a bit strange. Brandon was definitely on the quiet side, and some of the things he'd say would be unusual. It's hard to describe exactly. Anyway, our moms decided that it would be good for Brandon to get some socialization, because apparently he didn't have any friends. I'd had a few other sleepovers up to this point, but I had no idea what to expect with this one. It would also be at Brandon's house and not ours, which I didn't like. I asked my mom to cancel it, but all she did was strongly encourage me to go over, so she basically said no. We drove over around 4, since I'd be eating dinner with Brandon and his parents, neither of whom I knew. I think I saw Brandon's mom once or twice at various school functions, but his dad was someone I'd never met before. When we got to Brandon's neighborhood, I noticed it looked a bit run down. Maybe that's not the right term, and I don't mean to be condescending, but something about it gave off an unsettling vibe. It probably also had to do with the fact that I really didn't want to be there. We pulled up in front of Brandon's house, and my mom parked and we walked to his front porch. I had my sleeping bag and some kind of off-brand Transformers robot. After ringing the doorbell, it actually took a while for anyone to answer the door, and when they did, it was Brandon's mom. She greeted us very enthusiastically, but when she opened the door, I got a whiff of cigarette smoke. I looked at my mom, who I could tell was just now having second thoughts. Maybe Brandon's mom picked up on that, because she told my mom that they recently had company over and had been cleaning and trying to get the smell out. She assured my mom that their house was clean and that they had aired it out. After a few seconds, my mom said she'd pick me up in the morning, but then also bent down and told me that, if anything happened, to give her a call. My mom actually said this practically any time she dropped me off anywhere, but I could tell it was a bit different this time. For context, my parents had given me a very basic phone that didn't even have any games, and told me to use it in case of emergencies. I walked inside with Brandon's mom, and she closed the door behind us. I guess I got used to that smell, because I stopped smelling it after a while. When we walked through the front hallway, I saw the house had a little clutter, but it was clean for the most part. I then saw Brandon's dad sitting on the couch watching TV. He was drinking something. I'm not sure if it was alcoholic or not, but he didn't seem to acknowledge my presence. Brandon's mom was telling me about how I could have any snacks I wanted, and we could get pizzas for dinner. Honestly, I wasn't in the mood for pizza, but I also didn't want to speak up and suggest anything different. Something else that struck me as very odd was the fact that Brandon wasn't actually with us. He hadn't met us at the front door, and I didn't see or hear him anywhere downstairs. Their house had 2 stories, so I assumed he was upstairs in his room, which was correct. His mom told me to run upstairs and meet him. Now, I'm not the most sociable person myself, including when I was a kid, but I remember that being very off-putting. Either way, I took my sleeping bag and robot upstairs, since I assumed that's where we'd be sleeping, and walked over to what I thought was Brandon's room. I noticed the upstairs was messier, with clothes and stuff like magazines strewn around the hallway. I actually had to knock on the door, and only then did Brandon walk over and open the door. I felt like dying out of awkwardness. He opened the door and kind of smiled and told me to come in. I looked and then stepped inside, and his room was extremely messy. There were a lot of toys and stuffed animals, and judging from the smell, old food as well. Honestly, I didn't want to go in there, but I sucked it up and told myself it was only for one night. I made my way over to his bed, which was the only place to sit down aside from clearing a space on the floor. Brandon had a desk with a bookcase and a chair, but the chair had stuff stacked on top of it. So I sat on his bed. I still wasn't sure what we were going to do, and apparently Brandon didn't know either. He just sat on the floor and looked up at me and asked, "How's it going?" I was quickly finding out this kid had no social skills. Did he even want me to come over? I said something like, "I'm good. You want to play with toys?" Brandon told me yeah, but was apparently waiting for me to pick something. So I picked up one of Brandon's robots from the floor and handed it to him and told him we could have a robot battle. I'll gloss over a lot of the details so that the story doesn't get even longer and more boring. But needless to say, we weren't hitting it off. Finally, I heard a knock on the door, and it was a breath of fresh air, metaphorically and literally. Brandon's mom asked us what we wanted on our pizza. Brandon said pepperoni, and I said that was fine. Then Brandon's mom asked him if he was being good. Something about the way she said that was just creepy. Brandon shrugged his shoulders and looked away. I then suggested to Brandon that we go downstairs and play in his yard, which apparently he was fine with since he followed me out of his room. We got downstairs and I noticed his mom smoking on the back porch. I'd been suspicious of her story earlier, and this confirmed it in my mind that they didn't actually have anyone over and it was them who smoked. I honestly wanted to avoid her since I got a weird vibe from her, so we just sat down on his couch. Brandon's dad had left at this point. I don't know where he went. We just kept sitting there until I broke the silence and recommended we watch a movie. But then they didn't have any kid movies. I did notice some more grown-up movies, which in other situations I would have suggested we watch. But with Brandon's dad possibly being around and his mom right outside, this was not the ideal time and location. Therefore I asked if Brandon had any video games, to which he replied he didn't. Okay, so what was there to do? I didn't know at this point, so I put the question to Brandon. He told me there was a park nearby, and I actually lit up at that suggestion, since it meant we'd get out of the house. At that moment, Brandon's mom came in and greeted us and asked if we were having fun. I told her yeah, but Brandon didn't really say anything though. Then Brandon's mom picked up her phone and started ordering the pizzas. I guess she hadn't done that before her smoke break. We told his mom where we were going as we walked outside. Brandon and I had left our robots upstairs, and we didn't get anything from his garage, so we were literally just walking over. I tried to make small talk as we walked, but Brandon would almost always just give 1 or 2 word answers. Soon we were walking in silence, which was awkward, but also good in a way. 10 minutes later we got to a small neighborhood park that didn't have anyone else on it at the moment. I didn't know anything about this neighborhood, so I had no idea if there would even be other kids our age coming in. We swung on the swing sets for a little bit, and then slid down the slides. Then, that was pretty much it. I asked Brandon if there was anything else nearby we could walk to, but he shook his head. There wasn't a reason to stay there, but I also didn't really want to go back to Brandon's house either. So, we just kept swinging on the swings until Brandon told me we needed to go back because the pizza would be there. When we were almost back to his front porch, I heard yelling coming from inside his house. Brandon opened the door, and apparently his parents were having a heated argument about something. I don't know if it got physical or what it was about. They kept yelling even after we walked through the door. Brandon and I saw the pizzas on the kitchen table, so we just walked over and started eating. Then Brandon's dad left and slammed the door to the garage, and Brandon's mom, without even acknowledging it, cheerfully told us that the pizzas were here. Now maybe I'm just lucky to have a really good home life, because my parents would never argue in front of me and my brother like that, and especially not when there were guests over. So to see it was kind of scary. We each ate a few slices of pizza. Then, as I had been doing all day, I had to take the lead and suggest our next activity. I actually asked Brandon's mom if she needed to go anywhere, and if we could come too. That was very unusual for me, but it was only like 6, and Brandon and I had already exhausted all the activities we could do at his house. Brandon's mom told us she didn't need to go anywhere. I was hoping Brandon would ask something, like for us to get ice cream, but of course he didn't say anything. Brandon and I just kept sitting at the table, and I honestly didn't know what to do. Luckily, or unluckily, I didn't have to make the decision of what to do next, because 2 seconds later Brandon's dad violently opened the door to the garage again, and was carrying what appeared to be an empty wine bottle. I won't repeat the language, but he screamed something at Brandon's mom, who screamed back and picked up her glass and held it in a threatening manner. Brandon's dad took a step forward, and his mom actually threw her glass, with his dad dodging it just in time. I was frozen to the spot, and looked at Brandon, who seemed unfazed and just kept sitting there. When the altercation moved to another room, I took that opportunity to get up and go to the front door. I was kind of introverted, so I wouldn't have done something like that before, but this was different. I unlocked and opened the door, stepped outside, and called my mom. When she picked up, it sounded like she had anticipated I might call. When I told her that Brandon's parents were fighting, she flipped out and told me to stay outside and that she'd be right over. 15 minutes later, she pulled up and abruptly stopped. The passenger side window was already rolled down, and she quietly motioned for me to get in. I didn't look back as I walked over and got in the car. Not once while I was waiting did anyone open the front door, and though my sleeping bag and robot were still in Brandon's room, I wasn't going back in there. As we were driving home, my mom was very apologetic and kept asking me if I was alright. I think she knew the situation was her fault, but after a while I didn't really blame her. I could tell she was just trying to do something nice for Brandon and his family, and there was no way she could have known what was going to happen. Later that evening, my mom got a phone call, and it was Brandon's mom. Apparently she was trying to apologize for what happened, but my mom wasn't having any of it, and instead was giving her a piece of her mind. She told Brandon's mom that I would not be allowed to return to his house, and that Brandon needed to bring my sleeping bag and robot the next day at school. Monday came, and I was dreading how awkward it would be to see Brandon. Luckily, he didn't really talk to me, but just walked over to my desk right before school started and gave me my stuff. I put it over by our locker area and sat back down at my desk. I didn't interact much with Brandon during the rest of the school year, but as time has gone on, I felt bad and regretted that decision. I realized it was probably Brandon's home life that made him act the way he did. If I could go back in time, while I wouldn't go to his house again, I would have befriended Brandon, at least a little bit. It just shows that you never know what someone else is dealing with, and that can be sad. Story 2. My friend Macy and I were 10 when this story took place, and it is hands down the most terrifying thing to happen to us. Macy's dad would let us have sleepovers fairly regularly, especially during the summer, and he'd usually take us to the mall. The mall also had a movie theater, and we'd see a movie there sometimes as well. Macy's dad was almost always the one to chaperone us because her mom was a nurse and worked late into the evenings. I'm not quite sure what Macy's dad did, but I think it was mostly virtual. On the particular night in question, we'd gone out to eat at a restaurant and were getting ice cream somewhere else afterwards. We were waiting in line, picking out our flavors, when another family came in and cut in line ahead of us. Now Macy's dad is by no means a pushover, but he's not quick to get upset and always gives people the benefit of the doubt. He let the family, which was composed of a mom and her 2 young sons, order first. There was a lot of foul language being used, which I could see Macy's dad did not appreciate, and which honestly made us uncomfortable. The kids looked to be around 5 or 6, but they were saying some adult phrases and dropping F-bombs. After we ordered, we picked out a table far away from where the family was sitting. We could still hear them though, and Macy's dad could tell we didn't like it. Therefore, he got up and walked over, and asked the lady as politely as he could to have her kids watch their language. She stared at him for a second, before telling him to mind his own business. Macy and I were on edge, thinking her dad might do something, but instead he walked back over and sat down. He told us that we could eat our ice cream in the car, and we left the store. What happened next was so jarring that it seemed unreal. We were getting into Macy's dad's truck when the door to the ice cream store opened and that woman came out. She started yelling at Macy's dad, telling him again to mind his own business and that her kids weren't his kids. Macy's dad apparently ignored her and got in and closed the door. We hurried up and closed our doors too. Then the lady actually threw her cup of ice cream at our windshield. Macy's dad told us to wait inside and then aggressively opened the door and took several steps toward the lady. She stopped yelling for a moment as he told her loudly and matter-of-factly to leave us alone or there would be trouble. He got back in his truck and put his seatbelt on, and we drove away. That lady was just standing there, watching us. The drive back to Macy's house was awkward at first, but eventually we started to joke about what just happened with her dad. When we got to her house, we went inside and started watching a movie. This was around 9, and Macy's mom wasn't home yet, which wasn't unusual. Her dad got a towel from the kitchen and went back into the garage to wipe the remnants of ice cream off his truck. Then he came back inside and asked us if we needed anything. Macy told him we were good, so we went into their office room, presumably to do work. Halfway through the movie, I heard what sounded like scratching on the front door. I paused the movie and Macy heard it too. I think we both assumed it was Macy's mom, though why she'd be coming in the front door as opposed to the garage door, we didn't know. Macy walked over to the door to unlock it, but suddenly stopped and screamed. A second later, her dad bolted out from the hallway, asking what happened. Macy pointed to the door and started crying. Her dad looked through the peephole and started screaming to whoever was out there to get off his property immediately before he shot them with his shotgun. 2 guesses as to who the person was. Apparently the woman ran away pretty quick, but Macy's dad did indeed get his shotgun and opened the door. He told us to stay inside, and if anything happened to call the cops. Macy and I were both terrified at this point, though we didn't expect that the woman was armed, and we felt protected by her dad. However, nothing could prepare either of us for what happened next. We heard yelling from outside, and then what sounded like an explosion followed by a flash of light. Macy's dad ran back inside, still with his shotgun, and yelled at both of us to go out the back door. We of course did what he told us, and when we were in the backyard, he called 911 immediately and explained that we were followed home by a crazy woman who had doused the front yard with gasoline and lit it on fire. Those words were like a punch to our stomachs, and waiting there with Macy and her dad with his shotgun was the most terrifying experience of my life. I'm pretty sure it was the most terrifying experience of their lives too. 5 minutes later we heard sirens blaring, and only then did we walk around the side yard. Thank God the lady only spread gasoline near the front part of their yard by the street. Either that or she hadn't finished spreading it. Either way, it was just a grass fire, and had already burned out and nothing else was affected. Luckily the story has a happy ending, at least for us. Macy's dad managed to get the lady's license plate number, and the cops were able to track her down easily. During the investigation, a lot of things came to light, and let's just say that there were significant issues with that family. The children never even knew their dad, and CPS had already been involved. The lady herself had a criminal record, including shoplifting and assault. I wasn't privy to all the details, but I think that lady might have ended up in jail for a while. I'm sorry for her kids, and I hope their situation is somehow better now. It still blows my mind to think of how quickly things escalated, and I'm just glad that Ashley, her dad, myself, and their house were okay. Story 3. My dad let me have sleepover birthdays when I was in elementary school and junior high, and he honestly went all out with it. I think part of the reason was that his family was poor growing up, and he never got to have parties like that. But also because he's just a big kid at heart. One of the activities we do was to pick a grocery store to visit, and then have a bit of a shopping spree. After getting a cart, we'd start at one side of the store and go up and down the aisles until we got to the other side. My dad would pay for one thing out of each aisle, but the total cost had to be under $200. Now I'm sure that sounds ridiculous to a lot of people, and it kinda was. But what we picked out also included our dinner as well as snacks for the party. I share these details now because they'll be important later on. This story takes place during my 13th birthday when I was in the 7th grade. I have an October birthday, so the school year was just beginning. The school I went to was on the smaller side, and I had mostly the same group of kids in my classes for years. My 2 best friends were Tony and Andrew, but we were also friends with all the other boys, as the boys didn't really have any distinct cliques. However, when this school year started, we got a new transfer student. His name was Mike, and he was rather quiet. I did understand that to some degree, since he was the new kid after all, but as time went on, I felt like his quietness was less about being shy and more about being strange. All the boys in our lunch period sat at 2 medium-sized tables, and there was plenty of room, so he sat with us, but it was always in the corner. I like to think we were nice kids, so I doubt he ever got bullied. But with how odd Mike was, it was inevitable that he'd get picked on. But Mike wouldn't say anything back, and it seemed like he didn't care, so we mostly just left him alone. It had come up in conversation at the dinner table that Mike was going to our school, and when my birthday rolled around, my dad encouraged me to invite him to help him make friends. Normally I wouldn't be opposed to anything like that, but there was just something about Mike. Sometimes he mumbled, maybe talking to himself. Andrew also worked with him when they got paired up for a project, and told us that Mike didn't seem to have emotion, whatever that meant. I honestly didn't want him to sleep over with us, but I figured I'd get roped into having him come anyway, so I went ahead and agreed. When the day came, all my friends started being dropped off around 4 in the afternoon. Or maybe I should say guys, since I was friends with a few of the girls in our class, but we could only have same-sex sleepovers. Anyway, we were all giving ourselves high fives and putting the presents by the fireplace in the living room. Mike was the last one there. I think he arrived around 4:45. When my dad answered the door, he saw Mike just standing there. Apparently his mom or whoever drove him had already left. My dad joked that he wasn't sure Mike was coming. From what my dad later explained, Mike seemed to take that the wrong way and started to tense up. My dad felt bad immediately and tried putting a hand on his shoulder and told Mike he was just giving him a hard time. Mike tried to make a smile before walking off. Mike took a few steps into our living room and then stopped. Andrew and I looked at each other, not sure what he was doing. He saw us look at him and then lowered his gaze to the floor as he walked over and put a gift card on top of one of the presents by the fireplace. Mike then walked back to the other side of the room without greeting me. Andrew and I started snickering, not like we were picking on him, but just because it was a WTF moment. Mike sat down on one of our chairs and took out his phone. Meanwhile, my friends and I started joking about something that happened that day during school. I'm not sure if Mike thought we were talking about him, but it was hard to gauge because he didn't look up or make any kind of facial expressions that we could see. Eventually my dad made the announcement that we were going to depart soon for the store and pulled us to see where we wanted to go. There were a few options, but we picked a Jewel Osco, which for those who don't know is a chain of stores around Illinois and Indiana. Counting my dad and me, there were 8 of us total. That was alright, as my family had a van since I also had 3 younger sisters. And since they and my mom would go to stay with my aunt and uncle who lived close by during my birthday sleepovers. Yeah, my family definitely went all out for these kinds of parties. Anyway, we all loaded up in the van and my dad drove us over. After we got out, Tony and Andrew each got a cart from the cart return areas and started racing each other to the front of the store. Instead of telling them to stop, my dad was actually encouraging them, and the rest of us ran with them. Well, the rest of us except Mike. When we got to the front of the store, we looked back and saw him. He was doing kind of a power walk towards us. When we walked inside, my dad went over the rules again and asked us on which side we wanted to start. This particular store had the produce section on the left and the pharmacy section on the right. While the rest of my friends and I were talking, Mike walked over to my dad and asked to start at the pharmacy section. My dad said sure and informed the rest of us that that's where we'd be starting. Honestly, it's probably what we would have picked, as we thought it would be the best strategy, but we weren't sure what Mike was thinking. We really weren't sure when he walked over to the second aisle and picked out a bottle of vitamins. A few of us laughed, because we thought Mike was just trying to be funny, but based on the expression he gave us when he put it back, I think he was serious. When he did that, we weren't sure what to think, though thinking back to some of the things he'd do at school, this weirdly seemed to fit in. I won't go over the list of items we bought, though as you might expect there was a lot of junk food. However, there were a few relevant details to our shopping experience. About 1/3 of the way through, we were going down the cooking aisle, and Mike, honest to God, picked up a 6-inch cutting knife. That would have been a better joke than the vitamins, but he still seemed to be serious. This is also when I started to move from being weirded out by Mike to being actually afraid. Other things he tried to have us buy included a sewing kit with needles, a hammer, and a screwdriver set. To be clear, we didn't actually get any of those items. After checking out, we got back in the van and went home to make/eat dinner. Among the items we got were frozen hamburgers that just had to be heated, and a lot of meats like turkey, ham, and roast beef. We'd made kind of a joke about getting a lot of meat at the store. We got the food ready in batches while Andrew and one of my other friends picked out a movie for us to watch. It was one of the Terminator movies, maybe the second one. While the festivities were being carried on, I couldn't help but notice Mike, sitting off to the side, mumbling to himself. He wasn't even eating anything. I turned to Andrew and pointed out Mike, and Andrew just laughed. Maybe he was becoming concerned too, I don't know. Being the birthday boy, I figured it was my duty to try to make Mike feel more comfortable, though after everything that happened so far, I wasn't sure I was comfortable. I walked over to Mike and asked if he was hungry. Mike mumbled something, which I couldn't make out, so I told him I was sorry and asked again. The whole room fell silent when Mike looked up at me and screamed "No" at the top of his lungs. My dad, who was getting something from somewhere else in the house, rushed back and asked us if we were okay. We all just looked at him, not knowing what to say. My dad did pick up on the fact that our attention had been directed towards Mike. Therefore, he called me and Andrew over and took us into the garage. He asked us what had just happened, and I told him that I'd asked Mike if he was hungry, before Mike screamed. My dad then came back and asked Mike to come with us to the garage, while everyone else was still standing there being quiet. With the four of us in the garage, my dad asked Mike if he was okay. Mike didn't look my dad in the eye and muttered something like, "I'm sorry." At this point, we all figured Mike had some kind of issue, but I think my dad's patience was wearing a bit thin. He asked Mike very matter-of-factly if he wanted to stay or to leave, and told him that if he wanted to stay, that he couldn't scream like he did. Still looking away, Mike said, "I'll stay." A few seconds later, the four of us returned to the kitchen and living room area. Mike went over to grab one of the sandwiches we made, and we all slowly started talking again. I'm not sure anyone else talked to Mike after that, and honestly I couldn't blame them. I opened my present soon after that, and while I got some great stuff, it isn't really relevant to the story. I'm not sure what my dad was working on that evening, but he'd come back to check on us periodically, specifically Mike. Mike just sat there on one of the chairs we put in the living room, watching the movie with us and staying quiet. I forgot what we put on after the Terminator, but a bit after midnight some of us started to fall asleep. Mike was one of the first to fall asleep, and under different circumstances we might have taken that as an opportunity to mess with him. But not after what had happened. Those of us who had sleeping bags rolled them out in the middle of the room, making a big blanket kind of thing. The rest of us just slept on the two couches and chairs we pulled together. Mike was sleeping on the floor in the corner, and while I thought about offering him one of the pillows, I decided to just let him lie there. I forgot exactly when I passed out, but I do remember waking up around 3 a.m. I had to use the bathroom, so after tiptoeing around two of my friends, I made my way down the hall. Right as I got to the bathroom door, I jumped as I picked up on some low muttering. It was Mike, and where he was and how long he'd been awake were unknown to me in that moment. I had to go pretty bad, so I just went and then came back out. By that time, the mumbling had stopped. I started to walk down the hall leading to the bedrooms, since I hadn't come that way. The doors to my parents' and sister's room were all closed. I figured Mike wouldn't have been in there, so I turned around to head back to the kitchen/living room area. That's when I almost screamed. A millisecond after I turned my head, I saw Mike standing at the end of the hallway. He wasn't saying anything, and I only saw his silhouette with a tiny amount of light coming from the streetlight outside. Then I froze. Even though I'd been looking for him, I hadn't actually expected him to sneak up on me like that. But then, my life flashed before my eyes when I saw Mike was carrying a large kitchen knife. I'm not sure why I didn't scream then and there, but instead I asked Mike calmly to put the knife down. He didn't though, he just stood there. I told him we could talk and asked him again to put it down. Mike let out kind of a grunt and then ran towards me. In that moment of terror, I was able to open one of my sister's rooms and then body slammed the door shut. Mike started banging and screaming on the other side of it. Immediately my dad and everyone else woke up, and a second later there was shouting and Mike screamed in pain. As I learned later, my dad had grabbed the arm Mike was using to carry the knife, and Andrew had yanked it out of his hand. A few seconds later, my dad told me I could come out, and I opened the door to see my dad pinning Mike to the ground. One of my friends had put the knife back in the kitchen, and my dad had searched Mike's pockets, but found nothing. My dad then told Mike that he could get up if he didn't try anything, and Mike nodded. He let him up, and Mike just sat up and stared blankly at us. My dad told him that if he kept well away from me, my friends, and everyone else in our family, then he wouldn't call the cops. Mike nodded again. My dad asked Mike for his parents' phone number, and he gave it to him. Then my dad called it on his cell phone and spoke to Mike's mom. Surprisingly, it seemed like she didn't doubt anything my dad was telling her, and instead was making excuses. I remember my dad being livid and yelling that her kid better stay the F away from his kid. He commanded that she come over and pick him up immediately, and 15 minutes later there was a knock on our door. Before my dad let Mike go outside, he asked to speak with his mom as he stepped out onto the front porch and closed the door behind him. I have no idea what they said, but there wasn't shouting, and a minute later the door opened again and Mike's mom calmly asked for him to come with her. We let Mike through our little wall of boys of sorts, and he still had that stoic expression. Then the door closed and he was gone. Because it was still like 3:30, my dad suggested we all try to get a few hours of sleep, and told us that if there was anything funny, he'd deal with it. Understandably, it was hard to get sleep, but it was the weekend, so it didn't really matter. Around 8 a.m., my dad asked each of my friends to call their parents one by one, and he joined each conversation and informed them what happened. Most of the parents were immediately concerned and came right over to pick up their son, and I bet some of them tried to get in touch with Mike's mom as well. At this point, we weren't really scared, at least not my friends, and we were looking forward to Monday with a bit of curiosity. Monday came and Mike wasn't there, nor was he there on Tuesday or Wednesday. Instead, we never saw him again. I have no idea what happened, but I suspect Mike's mom pulled him out of school immediately after this took place, and he either went to a different school or maybe was homeschooled. None of us really knew that much about him, so it turned into a big mystery, and even an urban legend of sorts. For the rest of the year, as well as throughout high school, we'd periodically joke that Mike would show up again, like he'd be waiting at a bus stop. But he did never actually show up, at least as far as I know. Thinking back, after the shock and fear subsided, I felt really bad for Mike. Especially with how he tensed up at the beginning. I imagine he felt enormous pressure, whether because he wanted to fit in or for some other reason. Wherever he is now, I just hope he's doing all right.